Thomas Jefferson said of slavery in 1820, "It's as if we have a wolf by the ears, and we can either hold him or safely let him go. Justice is on one scale and self-preservation on the other." He referred to slavery as an assemblage of horrors. He spoke out against slavery vociferously in his first drafts of the Declaration of Independence, leading his fellow signers to encourage him to change the wording, lest they be condemned to free the slaves, should they in fact gain freedom from England. And of course, he began the Declaration of Independence with 5 of the most famous words in history: "All men are created equal." Yet Jefferson owned over 600 slaves during his lifetime, and he freed less than a half dozen of them upon his death, thus significantly distinguishing himself even from George Washington. Our speaker this evening will deliver a presentation to us about the Jays of New York, who exemplify perhaps an even greater paradox than Jefferson did. John Jay, Jefferson's contemporary and a New York representative to the Continental Congress, was a member of a family who had also had enslaved people in their households for generations, and yet eventually became staunch abolitionists right up to the time of the Civil War and beyond. Our speaker will talk about his research into this remarkable, influential family who were central to the American story. David Gellman is professor of history at DePauw University, where he has taught since 1999. His book, Liberty's Chains, Slavery, Abolition, and the Jay Family of New York, was published last spring of 2022, by Three Hills, an imprint of Cornell University Press. Among his other publications are Emancipating New York, The Politics of Slavery and Freedom, 1777 to 1827, and Jim Crow, New York, a documentary history of race and citizenship, 1777 to 1877. Both were selected as choice outstanding academic titles. He's a member of the editorial board of the Journal of the Early Republic and has held research fellowships at the Huntington Library, the American Antiquarian Society, and the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery. Professor Gellman.
Thank you for that warm introduction. And I want to say a special thank you to Lily Osborne, who I know was critical in bringing me here. And it's a real distinct honor to be with you here tonight. And thank you also, of course, for those joining online. You're missing a very rainy, cold New England night, so might have been a good move to stay at home. But thank you so much for coming out tonight. On Thursday evening, May 12th, 1859, Frederick Douglass delivered a eulogy at Manhattan's Shiloh Presbyterian Church. A largely African-American audience was there to honor the memory of William Jay, who had passed away the previous October. Douglass declared of Jay, "In the great cause of universal freedom, his name was a tower of strength and his pen a two-edged sword." Quietly bringing his rousing remarks to an end, the former fugitive observed, "He has taught us how to live. He has taught us how to die." Douglass and his audience well understood that the name Jay had a special power in American history and life. William Jay's father, John Jay, was one of the most important founding fathers of the early republic, a republic which in 1859 was splintering dramatically. Highlights of the elder Jay's resume include inaugural Chief Justice of the United States, appointed by his admirer and political confidant, George Washington, President of the Continental Congress during the Revolutionary War, Secretary of Foreign Affairs after the war, and negotiator of 2 of the nation's most important treaties with Great Britain, the latter of which, the Jay Treaty, has forever since borne his name. He was also the principal author of New York's first Constitution and one of the leading advocates of the ratification of the US Constitution. And he topped off his long public service with 2 terms as governor of New York State. Like almost all of the founders of the first rank, except for John Adams, John Jay also enslaved men, women, and children. His treatment of the enslaved and formerly enslaved ranged from kindness to callousness to cruelty. Paradoxically, John Jay had played a role in slavery's demise in the North. In the 1780s, he served as the inaugural president of the New York Manumission Society, one of the world's first anti-slavery organizations. In 1799, he was governor when New York State passed its flawed and profoundly significant gradual emancipation law. But his son, William J., devoted his last 2 decades of his long life to the cause of African-American freedom, the cause most likely to sunder the nation that his father had played such an important role in knitting together. And this made the J name a lightning rod in the stormiest of times. In his brilliant eulogy, Douglass sought to channel that electricity into the ongoing struggle for human rights. John Jay II, an estimable abolitionist in his own right, who had provided Douglass with source material for the eulogy, was so pleased by Douglass's remarks that he purchased 200 copies of the speech in pamphlet form. My biography of the Jays sprawls across parts of 4 centuries and many generations. I interrogate the transmission and transformation of anti-slavery values, principles, and rhetoric, as well as tactics. And I integrate the lives of generations of enslaved and formerly enslaved people who tested the limits of sympathy, demonstrated that the personal was political, and endured much sorrow. I hope I make my readers think deeply about what we mean by words we use all the time, like radical, conservative, and patriot. The work has strengthened my conviction that studying the legacy of the founding alongside the legacy of slavery is not exclusively a Southern issue. Thomas Jefferson and George Washington are, of course, vital figures, but there are other places on the map and other stories to tell to help us think more clearly about where we've been in the past and where we might be heading next. In that spirit, I want to focus tonight on the role of place and region in my story, with special emphasis on New England in the lives of the white and Black New Yorkers who are my main characters. Lately, as I've reflected back on the project, I've been struck by how much of the Jay's particular path from slaveholding to abolitionism is very much a national story, but one that derives its power and its specificity from their location and connection to certain places. Focusing on some of these locations strikes me as a good way to introduce you to their story. And it's also worth stating that with a few adjustments in history, things could have turned out very differently. In other words, there's nothing inevitable about the story I'm going to tell tonight, that it was contingent on time, place, and also on character. And hopefully that will come through in our conversation tonight. Take the fact that the founder of the American branch of the Jay family, Auguste Jay, a Huguenot refugee from France in the wake of the end of France's toleration of Protestantism in 1685, initially sailed to South Carolina. Had he stayed there, he may well have joined the ranks of what emerged as a thriving plantocracy. Huguenot families prospered in South Carolina in particular. One, the Lorens, established a slave trading empire. Auguste, however, decided to forsake South Carolina for New York. There, through marriage and business connections, he made his way into the Anglo-Dutch elite. He even anglicized his name to Augustus and became a pillar of the Anglican Church in Manhattan. New York did not become a full-blown slave society like South Carolina, but through the dealings of families such as the Livingstons, the Phillipses, the Van Cortlands, the Morrises, and yes, the Jays, slavery and enslaved people were a robust part of the economy. Indeed, Manhattan's economy boomed initially in the early 18th century because of its connections with the West Indies, where the slave sugar plantation complex produced great wealth based on great misery, and New York supplied much of the plantocracy concentrates so heavily on producing sugar that a grain cereal producing port like New York is a key connection, and that's kind of how the Jays get into the slave trading business. Because it was definitely a part of their business. A ship co-owned with his son-in-law, Pierre Mallet, carried 64 enslaved people to New York from Jamaica across 4 voyages in 1725 and 1727. Augustus's son, Peter, John Jay's father, joined his father and brothers-in-law in business. Their ship, the Dolphin, carried 47 people to New York between 1730 and 1733, from such islands as Jamaica, Barbados, Curacao, and Antigua. This trafficking in human beings was hardly anonymous. In Peter Jay's ledger, you can see transactions involving an individual boy and an individual girl. Men enslaved by Augustus and Peter Jay, moreover, played a role in the records of the infamous alleged 1741 plot by Manhattan slaves. Brash, owned by Peter, testified to the authorities that Ben, owned by Augustus, had brought him into a conspiracy to, quote, rise against the town, to burn the houses, and to kill the people. The alleged ringleader, a white tavern owner named Houston, Brash claimed, induced them to swear to murder their own masters and mistresses. Now, Brash sort of saved his own life. And there's reasons, so lots of reasons to question the testimony around this alleged conspiracy. He implicated Ben. Ben had already, before this all blew up, had already been sold to Madeira far, far away. And so he's implicating someone who can't tell a different story. And this may indeed have saved his own life, because unlike approximately 80 other African Americans who were capitally punished, Brash himself was transported to Madeira in the wake of this trial. And here's my one sort of very local reference. One New England commentator looking at the events in New York likened it very much to the Salem witch trials that his region had experienced a generation before. And perhaps it was in some ways a fantasy of white slaveholders in New York. On the other hand, at the very least, what this event shows is that Blacks and lower status whites socialized, traded, fenced stolen goods, and expressed their frustrations with a brutal, exploitative, hierarchical society, and that their masters believed that they were capable and willing to engage in such a conspiracy. So although historians to this day are still arguing how to interpret this event and whether it was, in fact, a witch trial of sorts, or whether it really was conspiracy, it reveals the underlying tensions and the violence that is just beneath the surface in New York. Again, not a full-blown slave society like South Carolina, but very much a society where slavery defines life. And this remained true for the Jays when Peter Jay moved the family to Rye in Westchester County in 1745, the same year that his wife, the former Mary Van Cortlandt, gave birth to their 8th child, John Jay. As in Manhattan, slavery was a fixture of the household. The 1755 census for Rye shows that Peter Jay's household owned 8 people over the age of 14, which presumably meant there were also unrecorded children as well. Growing up as a New Yorker, the future founding father, John Jay, had every reason to think of slavery as a normal institution, a labor system and a caste system that helped enrich its merchants, enhance the comforts of the landed elite, and contribute to the wealth and well-being of large numbers of ordinary artisans and farmers up and down the Hudson River, as well as on Long Island, Staten Island, and very much so Manhattan. As a revolutionary leader, John began to contemplate American liberation from British bondage and what a better political order might look like. He also tentatively at first began to question the justice of African American bondage as part of that future order, as part of that emerging order. He was not unique among white founders in having such thoughts, as the introduction mentioned. Even members of the Southern plantocracy, men like John Laurens of South Carolina and famously Thomas Jefferson, wondered whether a free country should rely on slavery. That said, contemplating slavery's future from Manhattan or Rye or Kingston, New York, and also because John Jay spent much of the revolution in Spain and France, contemplating slavery from those places was very different from contemplating the institution from Charleston or Monticello or Mount Vernon, and also quite different from contemplating slavery's future from Hartford or Boston or Salem. Going back to my theme that where you are has a key role in how you view these issues. John Jay was one of the primary authors of New York State's 1777 Constitution, as I mentioned, though he had to depart the proceedings toward the end to attend to his dying mother, and he expressed regret to his ally, Gouverneur Morris, and also to Robert Livingston, that the new charter failed to include any anti-slavery language. Though it's worth noting that Morris had very much tried to get that language into the New York Constitution. It didn't get in, and that's one of the first records we have of John Jay in writing, expressing in 1777. Basically, that it would have been nice if some sort of anti-slavery principles had made its way into the Constitution. As president of the Continental Congress, John Jay received a pamphlet from pioneering Pennsylvania Quaker anti-slavery activist Anthony Benezet and recorded his endorsement of the principles of universal freedom on the back of that pamphlet. Several days later, Jay presided over the Congress's endorsement of a daring pilot program, never actually implemented, to start enlisting thousands of South Carolina slaves in the Revolutionary War effort with the promise of their freedom. The Continental Congress actually endorsed this plan, but South Carolina politicians, as well as George Washington, prevented it from going into effect. But Jay was sitting in the president's chair when this was passed. Jay's subsequent service as a diplomat in Spain and France revealed the limits and the contradictions of his early anti-slavery stirrings. While Jay applauded from overseas Pennsylvania's landmark 1780 gradual emancipation law, the fact is that he and his wife, Sarah Livingston Jay, brought Abby, an enslaved woman with them from the US, and acquired a slave in Martinique named Benoit on their way to Europe. So, both these things are happening at once. Abby, as we might discuss later, suffered a tragic end in Europe. Moreover, Jay and his colleagues, Ben Franklin, John Adams, and Henry Lawrence, insisted on provisions in the peace treaty that they negotiated with Britain that forbade the British from departing the new nation with the enslaved people who had gathered behind their lines with the promise of freedom. Among the 3,000 African Americans who departed with the British from Manhattan in the fall of 1783 was one enslaved person formerly owned by John Jay. That said, John Jay returned to New York in 1784, more convinced than ever that slavery was in fact a violation of natural law and that something should be done about this fact. In 1785, he served as Secretary of Foreign Affairs for the Continental Congress. And so he had, in some ways, an opportunity to do something. But he was also selected at the same time, and he was the Chief Foreign Policy Officer of the United States. He was also the inaugural president of the New York Manumission Society, as I mentioned a few minutes ago. And he presided over that group until he took the job as the inaugural Chief Justice in 1789. And the New York Manumission Society was essentially devoted to three things. One, passing and enforcing limits on the power of slave owners in New York. One of the key things they did is make it illegal to either import any further slaves from other states and also to transport enslaved people out of New York. So they sort of tried to seal the institution within New York State and then enforce other laws surrounding the practice of slavery. They also advocated for a gradual emancipation law in the state based on the formula that Pennsylvania pioneered and then that Connecticut and Rhode Island also adopted. And the basic formula when I refer to gradual emancipation is you set a date and say all people born to enslaved mothers after this date will receive their freedom, but they will be obligated to serve their mother's masters. And then each state set a different age for when that freedom would go fully into effect. And that's the formula that Jay's Manumission Society, which was largely, by the way, staffed by Quakers who had rid slavery from their own society, but realized if they were going to get anywhere against slavery, they're going to have to partner with prominent non-Quakers, such as John Jay and Alexander Hamilton and many other prominent New York politicians. So it was always a collaboration. And the third thing was they established the African Free School, a school for both enslaved and free Black children that had tremendous influence and impact on the future shape of the free Black community in New York. Many of the most prominent free Black New York leaders of the next generation were educated in the school that the society founded. So without going into too much detail, I found it useful to think of John Jay's approach to slavery in this era in the 1780s and the 1790s as concentric circles. There's the personal sphere, the state and regional sphere, the national sphere, and then the international sphere. And he acts very differently in each of these spheres, even at the same time. In the personal sphere, he clearly emphasized his and his family's comfort and convenience. There can be no doubt about that. The 1790 census, the first federal census, recorded 5 enslaved individuals in the Jay's household in Manhattan. In that year, John Jay acquired a man named Pete, specifically and explicitly because as Chief Justice back in those days, you rode circuit. There was no temple of justice. There was no Washington, D.C., let alone any sort of permanent home to the Supreme Court. They divided up the country and there were very few federal judges. So the Supreme Court justices, in addition to its constitutional functions that we're familiar with, they rode circuit to hear cases. And so John Jay is bumping through the highways and byways of upstate New York and New England, which was his territory, and he wanted a body man. He wanted a personal servant, and he actually purchased Pete this from the most just recently resigned president of the New York Manumission Society. So, and that's in the personal sphere. This continues to go on. At the state level, as I've already suggested, and as the fact that he was the president of the Manumission Society, he favored advocacy and action. Again, education, protecting African Americans from being kidnapped or exported out of state, and the principle of eventual freedom and citizenship. Indeed, he was even willing to pay a political price for his identity with such principles. So he found the circuit riding of the Chief Justice, of being a justice in the Supreme Court, onerous enough that he decided to run for governor of New York in 1792 as a preferable job. And his identity with the Manumission Society, even though he had resigned, may have been part of the reason he lost this incredibly close election. There was some grumbling that one of his supporters passed along to him, one of the people sort of in his campaign, if you will, saying, you're kind of getting a reputation. People fear you're going to basically free the slaves of ordinary farmers. And John Jay said, well, of course, this is exaggerated. I favor gradual emancipation, but he also made it clear that he did not disavow the underlying principle of natural rights and his ultimate expectation that African Americans would become free and become citizens. And in this extremely close election, that may have been contributed to his margin of defeat. And then, as I already alluded, he eventually becomes governor. In his second term as governor in 1799, the state finally passes the gradual emancipation law, where they set the date of, not coincidentally, of July 4th, and say all children born to enslaved mothers after July 4th will be free, and then the males will serve until age 28 and the females until age 25, which in this era, particularly under the conditions that enslaved people were likely to labor, the lifespans of this era is well into adult life. Nonetheless, the law did have a decisive ultimate effect on slavery and its demise in New York, which was the largest slave state north of Maryland. So at the national level, the news is, again, so you can see oscillating personally, owns slaves. At the state level advocates gradual emancipation. At the national level, he found this a lot trickier. When the British abolitionist Granville Sharp expressed his dismay upon reading the new US Constitution that it did so little to combat the institution, Jay explained that, quote, passions and, quote, local interests trumped, quote, reason and principle. Moreover, quoting again, the importance of union rendered it necessary that the wishes of the pro-slavery regions be gratified. So he basically concedes that the price of union was compromised to the interest of slaveholders, and there are a lot of infamous compromises in the Constitution. And of course, John Jay was famously a powerful advocate. He was one of the people, as Joe Ellis labeled them, the quartet that kind of encouraged George Washington to give his imprimatur to the idea of a constitutional convention. And then Jay famously was one of the authors of the Federalist Papers and a major advocate of ratification in New York. And so he embodies and embraces a form of nationalism that made him admit kind of ruefully to Granville Sharp, yeah, we can't do anything at the national level, not yet, not for a long time. The picture brightens a little bit when we then zoom out to the international level, where he showed more flexibility and sometimes even more daring. So even as he was the sitting Chief Justice of the United States, he was the one, without resigning his Chief Justiceship, that Hamilton and Washington identified as the person to go to Britain to stave off impending war between the British and the United States in the mid-1790s. And they trusted him to cut a deal to stave off what they thought would be a disastrous war for the new United States. One of the issues in theory that the United States was there to bring up was the fact that, as I alluded to earlier, the British departed with thousands and thousands, something around 13,000 people, African Americans, departed with the British to their freedom at the end of the Revolutionary War. And that was on the sort of long list of what American nationalists wanted him to bring up. Jay got nowhere with his British counterpart, Lord Grenville, but he also decided that Grenville had a stronger moral argument and that the United States actually didn't really have moral standing to demand compensation for the former slaves who the British had sailed away with. Moreover, in letters describing to the Secretary of State, a Virginian by the name of Edmund Randolph, where he says, that it would be odious of us, morally odious of us to make this claim. I was convinced by the British that it would be wrong. You can see the steam when you read Randolph's replies. You can see the steam coming out of his ears that John Jay has, betrayed them and has basically done so little to advance what is more about Southern interests than a Northern interest. And John Jay was criticized roundly in the New York press, not just by Southerners, for his caving on the issue of compensation. But like I say, Jay acknowledged we really didn't have the moral standing, and it would have been, he also said, and Hamilton also argued, completely a foolish risk to take, to drive a hard line there. At this point, I kind of want to move the discussion closer to New England, at least Southern New England, to move the generational story along, and also help us explore the mindset, because I'm sure many of you are rightly puzzled and troubled by the gradual emancipation mindset that dominated abolition in the North. So John Jay sent his second son, William Jay, to Yale, which was then under the firm grip of a man by the name of Timothy Dwight, a poet, a minister, a reformer, and a thinker who structured his curriculum, at least the sort of ethical part of the curriculum, about having students debate moral and ethical issues. And they did it year after year after year. So I don't have William Jay's notebooks, but the same set of debates came up year after year after year. And so I got to read and think about what would history be like if all we knew was what students recorded in their professors' lectures. So that was an interesting exercise, but it also gave you a little insight into how they structured the ethical issue of slavery into Yale's curriculum at the turn of the 19th century. So what he learned was that his father's brand of gradualism was affirmed. Yale did diversify his perspective in a lot of ways. There were a lot of Southern students there. He also encountered New England Puritans, and it stoked his personal ambitions, but it did not in any way undermine his notion of gradualism. Dwight himself practiced a similar form of gradualism as his own father, acquiring enslaved people and then freeing them after he felt they had worked off their purchase price, which is something John Jay did and something President Dwight of Yale also did. The text that Dwight used for his senior year moral philosophy course was cautious and paternalistic. The slave trade itself was labeled an unequivocal evil, but slavery itself could only be safely, argued this textbook, be ended gradually, a product of law, not violent upheaval. Dwight saw anti-slavery as part of the gradual spread and triumph of Christian consciousness, not something that was going to happen overnight. When students tried out their own expressions in formal debates, it was clear that the moderate position was designed to triumph over the radical one. When debating whether the discovery of America was on balance a good or bad things, students were kind of trained to think, well, if you're going to make an argument that on balance the discovery of the Americas was bad, the slave trade was the sort of was the intellectual move to make. But the way these debates were supposed to play out, the growth of Europe's population as well as advances in science and medicine were supposed to more than trump the mass death of Native Americans and African Americans or Africans in the slave trade. That's how the debate was sort of structured. Records suggest that students did not take the idea of immediate Black freedom seriously, fearing, quote, idleness and dissipations, or worse, race war, something that Thomas Jefferson also would later emphasize, or actually not so later, around this time was also emphasizing. As an 18-year-old graduate of Yale, William was eager to take up his career in law, but like almost all anti-slavery whites of the era, he was not yet fired by a spirit of radical moral fervor or bold confrontation with the status quo. But winds of change were going to blow from New England and change things dramatically. So William ultimately settles in northern Westchester County in a homestead that John Jay built for his retirement, which was a very long retirement. John Jay lived to 1829. So William is, as a lawyer and a judge, is living in his father's house alongside his father. And if I have, one regret is that, I can study history through the letters people write, but when they live together, you're not privy to the conversations. And one can only imagine as they read the newspapers and talked about issues, how William Jay and John Jay shaped each other in these conversations. As I say, the winds of change pretty dramatically. That's an older picture of William. He would have looked much younger at this time. And William, who had a distinctly moralistic temperament and a sharp mind, his winds of change actually prompted William ultimately to sail into the stormy seas of radical abolitionism and sectional conflict. In 1831, William's Massachusetts cousin by marriage, Western Massachusetts, Theodore Sedgwick II, published a pamphlet questioning the racist assumptions on which the defense of slavery rested, and argued that free labor systems would produce greater prosperity in the South. And William Jay was very taken by his cousin's argument in this pamphlet that he read. South Carolina's attempt to nullify the federal tariff, which touched off a mini sectional crisis, deepened William's sense that the political instability, inherent desire to be free, would lead Southern Blacks to rise up. That South Carolina and other Southern states were sitting on top of a volcano, and far wiser to free people proactively than wait to see when this volcano would blow. At this very same time, radical New Englanders led by the Boston editor William Lloyd Garrison, whose newspaper, The Liberator, initially was heavily relied on African-American subscribers, began to agitate for a new kind of abolitionism, one premised on racial equality and on immediatism, the idea that slavery is a sin, and if it's a sin, you don't renounce sin 10 years from now, you don't renounce it gradually, you embrace it very much in sort of the spirit of the Second Great Awakening, that you can transform yourself. You can transform yourself vis-a-vis God, vis-a-vis consumption of alcohol, vis-a-vis all kinds of moral issues, including slavery. And this is the spirit that started to move William in the direction of abolitionism. Indeed, in some ways, Garrison knew before William Jay himself where this was going to go. So William Jay, before he joined any formal organization, wrote a letter to a New York anti-slavery newspaper that The Liberator immediately picked up. Because William Jay, the son of John Jay, Garrison trumpeted, has basically proven that if he is for immediate abolition, if he is with us, argued Garrison completely inaccurately, then we'll no longer be denounced as fanatics and madmen. Now that we have this respectable county judge and son of a founder, we're in the clear. That was wildly optimistic, and William Jay wasn't quite ready to commit to this organization that so wholeheartedly embraced Black political rights, embraced interracial collaboration, and had such a combative style. Again, William Jay would get there, but he was a little bit leery of these radical New Englanders. A couple of things changed to push him into the Garrisonian camp. One, his son, John Jay II, a college student at Columbia, who would nudge his father forward, and any of you whose children have brought you into more progressive ways of seeing things can relate to this story. John Jay II, I think, played a really important role in bringing his father along, and also race riots that John Jay II himself witnessed also helped to bring William Jay firmly into the radical abolitionist camp. So John Jay II, and again, people went to college much younger, so he's about 17 years old at the time, joins an organization called the New York Young Men's Anti-Slavery Society, which saw itself as an adjunct of the American Anti-Slavery Society and embraced, to quote them, intellectual, moral, and political equality. So not just abolitionism, but the notion of full equality. When 3 days of violent anti-abolitionist riots broke out in Manhattan in July 1834, John Jay II was on the front lines. He defended the home of one of the American Anti-Slavery Society's board members, and also the warehouse of businessman Arthur Tappan, who was the president of the American Anti-Slavery Society. So he's seeing this firsthand. White rioters, egged on in the pages of key New York newspapers, directed special brutality towards African Americans. Churches and schools came under attack. In the integrated 5 Points area of Manhattan, mobs singled out Black homes while leaving white homes unmolested. Black businesses were assaulted, and all this was driven by rumors of abolitionists sponsoring interracial marriages and the reality that abolitionists, white and Black, had in fact started to cooperate across the color line. Respectable classes thought this was shocking and were perfectly willing to stir up lower class New Yorkers dead set against the idea of Black social equality. This did not shake the commitment of college student John Jay II, who signed on to his organization's overt rejection of gradual abolitionism. In other words, rejecting his grandfather and namesake's way, and also participated with African Americans in initiatives for adult education and Sunday school classes. So he's a real activist on the ground in New York, while Williams, with his pen up in Westchester, thinking about what's due next. And he gets there in a letter that he writes to Henry Ludlow, who was a minister at one of the white churches that was ransacked. You find him using the language of us, as in, no hope or expectation of conciliating our enemies should ever induce us to conceal or surrender any of our fundamental principles. The violence was intended to intimidate us. So here we finally see William saying, I am with the angels on this one. And the next year, he joins the executive board of the American Anti-Slavery Society, which is headquartered in New York City, and writes his first major abolitionist book, which is a searing indictment of the notion of colonizationism, the idea that if African Americans are to be free, they have to be moved somewhere, whether it's out west or ultimately Liberia becomes the sort of place that is drawn up as the place where free blacks should be moved. Complete rejection of colonizationism and a full embrace of the principles of the American Anti-Slavery Society, which he had been very nervous about and skeptical of not very long before. This was not well received, his move by the respectable quarters. William Stone, the editor of the Commercial Advertiser, likened immediatism to a sickness, quote, a contagion like the cholera. And New York City Dr. David M. Rees proclaimed William Jay had fallen in with the, quote, zealots. And now on the issue of slavery, Jay had, quote, become disqualified from sober thinking. They could not believe a law and order judge and son of John Jay. He must have been deranged, right? This is zealotry. So quite the opposite of what Garrison predicted. With the respectable William Jay, we will be respectable. In fact, what they decided is something has gone terribly wrong in the mind of this respectable pillar of the establishment. Such jibes would not deter William Jay from bending the family's great and good name in this bold new direction. He wrote a series of really important books, one where he used federal policy towards slavery from the Constitution, basically into the late 1830s when he published the book. He moves far and fast on the issues of racial equality. So he writes a brilliant pamphlet denouncing racism in the North. So he recognizes that racism sustains slavery and sustains the kind of superstitious caste thinking, to use the word he used. He used the word caste in the mid-19th century. That's become a major best-selling and important book on the history of race. And that is exactly how William viewed slavery, superstition. And he said, in Northerners who won't be buried in the same burial grounds, who will not allow African Americans to serve on juries or to attend schools, they are simply carrying out this sort of caste-like thinking. Later on, he would write a scathing analysis of the Mexican War on anti-slavery grounds and many others. He also engaged Black activists in New York City, like David Ruggles, and played a really important role in the future of Alexander Crummell, who's one of the most important Pan-Africanist thinkers of the 19th century. He started as a free Black New Yorker who wanted to be ordained in the Episcopal Church, and Bishop Benjamin Onderdonk of New York said, absolutely not. And the Jays took up his cause, both with their pens and also provided funding and a network so that he finished his education and his ordination and would go on to have an incredibly important role in African-American thought. Also, the Jays, both John Jay II and William Jay, participate in the Underground Railroad. So William Jay traveled a long, long way from his college professor's gradual, temperate approach to anti-slavery. Now, it's easy from a distance to celebrate the path that William Jay and John Jay II took as not only right, but obvious. And compared to the enslaved people for whom they advocated and the free Black people they employed, their discomforts were minor. Even so, as creatures of Westchester County in New York City, this path could be a lonely one. For one thing, the alliance with the New England Garrisonian radicals could not and did not last. So their initial partners, that partnership dissolved for a variety of reasons, not the least of which was the New Englanders' insistence on women's equal rights within the organization. The Jays left the Anti-Slavery Society in the 1840s. In terms of temperament, style, and ideas about the US Constitution, the collaboration had always been an awkward one. It's worth pointing out that Frederick Douglass himself will leave the Garrisonians in the American Anti-Slavery Society for philosophical and personal reasons too. But the Jays in part found the style and some of the sort of what they saw as ancillary issues like women's rights as kind of mucking things up and distracting people. But they never, ever, and from that moment forward, never abandoned their bedrock commitment to anti-slavery. And the politics of Westchester County and Manhattan were decidedly hostile to abolitionists like the Jays. As I described in the book, William Jay's Westchester neighbors at least one time turned to crude, indeed obscene, racial harassment as a way of expressing their displeasure with this pillar of their community. Eventually, a Democratic governor decided he could no longer tolerate having such an avid abolitionist on the bench and basically forced William Jay into retirement. John Jay II, who was the most important pro bono lawyer for accused fugitives in New York City, was once punched in the face for aggressively questioning a witness in a fugitive slave case. In other words, the master who was claiming this person as his slave got so frustrated with John Jay II, he punched him in the face and still got to take his enslaved person back to Maryland. So this violence in the courtroom did not, turn the case around. So, I mean, that gives you a sense of the climate of opinion that the Jays are working against. I mean, John Jay II, I mean, he really did, even though he's an elite lawyer and has the name John Jay and is well-educated and wealthy, he went after institutions. He sued the city's medical school because they expelled an African-American because it was revealed that he had mixed ancestry. And he sued the school. He didn't win, and that person ended up graduating from Dartmouth instead. But this kind of activity, the constant haranguing of the Episcopal Church to let St. Philip's Parish, which is the main African-American parish in New York, which was banned from the Episcopal Convention in New York from its founding, year after year after year, John Jay II will stand up in that convention and say, this is injustice. And only in 1853 did the cause carry. So, I mean, he sort of made himself into a little bit of a pariah. In fact, he was once blackballed from an elite organization because of his sort of rabble-rousing on the issues of race. And so I guess one of the points I want to make, and this is going to get us to New England in a second, is they had to look for friends and also found enemies far afield from Manhattan. One of their, William Jay's key allies is a man named Gerrit Smith in upstate New York, who was also very close to Frederick Douglass, and I think that's kind of the connection between the two. Solomon P. Chase, an Ohio lawyer, up-and-coming anti-slavery politician, read William Jay's work on the federal government and slavery, as he's also sort of beginning his career as a defender of alleged fugitives. But New England was a real source of both allyship and aggravation. And I've put three key figures here. Daniel Webster, John Quincy Adams, and William Sumner. So New York, for Webster, top corner here, William Jay was absolutely horrified by what he thought as Daniel Webster's always compromising on behalf of Union and slaveholders' interests when it came to slavery. William Jay already, long before he got into anti-slavery, thought it was morally vacuous, the credo, my country, right or wrong. In fact, in his biography of John Jay, which he publishes in 1833, that's one of the points he makes, that he never gave into that facile and ultimately indefensible logic of my country, right or wrong. And so when we would look at Daniel Webster, who in some quarters to this day sort of embodies nationalism and unionism as sort of a civil religion, when Daniel Webster is Secretary of State, and the Creole Rebellion happens, where a group of enslaved people who are about to be transported from Richmond to New Orleans, led by a man named Madison Washington, an enslaved man named Madison Washington, rebel on the ship and sail to the Bahamas, where the British have already abolished slavery. And Secretary of State Daniel Webster insists that the British should return these enslaved people. And William Jay, writing against the policy, therefore, of his own government, writes a see a series of newspaper articles that becomes a pamphlet, denouncing this and saying the British should not give in, they should not buckle under to the demands of Secretary of State Daniel Webster. And he's completely horrified when Daniel Webster, who gives this famous speech in March 1850 during the crisis of 1850 about the devotion to the Union, and therefore is part of the compromise that brings the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 into the federal code. The Jays were utterly disgusted with this sort of compromise, which, keep in mind what I told you about John Jay and the Constitution and the frank acknowledgement that if we want a union and a constitution, we're going to have to compromise with these slaveholders. 50 years on, 60 years on, the Jays find that logic completely morally unsustainable. They much preferred, you want to have the fun of using the pointer, they much preferred John Quincy Adams, whose star burned really bright. Now, William Jay and John Quincy Adams had a lot in common. They are both sons of founding fathers of the first rank, who, although John Quincy Adams was president for one term, who sort of ultimately devoted their lives to unpopular causes. John Quincy Adams, almost essentially got expelled from the House of Representatives for trying to get around the gag rule preventing people from bringing anti-slavery petitions to the floor of the House. William Jay was also played a role in getting John Quincy Adams involved in the famous Amistad case. Some of you may be familiar with Steven Spielberg's movie. Sadly, there is no William Jay character in that movie. Great movie, great director, but it should have been a William Jay character. But William Jay is one of the people who is feeding John Quincy Adams information and also kind of encouraging John Quincy Adams to take a role. I'm not giving William Jay the sole credit, but that was the kind of thing that John Quincy Adams did that really, and opposing, of course, the war with Mexico. He was one of the few people who, when the United States, people talk about this war is not a good idea, we're not for it, folks manipulating us, but very hard then as now for congressmen and congresswomen to actually vote against funding wars. John Quincy Adams was part of that sort of gold run who proposed this. And so he writes, there's a chapter near the end of William Jay's book on the Mexican War that's just a beautiful eulogy to a notion of principle over politics, principle over expedience, that the kind of nationalism we need is one that prizes integrity over public opinion. And in writing that about John Quincy Adams, William Jay is also, of course, in some ways writing it himself. Fortunately for the Jays, Charles Sumner is an up-and-coming politician in Massachusetts who they hope is going to be the mold of John Quincy Adams, perhaps the next generation of John Quincy Adams. When Sumner declined to run for Congress in 1846, John Jay II said, "It's just a matter of time, quote, before your voice may be heard in our national councils in vindication of those glorious principles of right which you have so nobly maintained in your own New England." Sumner, for his part, was an admirer of William Jay's writings and would provide the aging abolitionist with letters of introduction when William traveled to England in 1856. So there's a real connection between Sumner and the Jays. Sumner indeed rose to the political heights that John Jay II predicted. And John Jay II was always encouraging him cajoling him to give more speeches about slavery. When he gave speeches on slavery, lavishing with his praise, and helping to publish those. And of course, moving forward, famously, on May 21st, 1856, Sumner gave a speech in the midst of the Bleeding Kansas controversy that led to this incident. So before John Jay II knows that Sumner is going to get caned on the floor of the Senate by Congressman Preston Brooks for what Brooks saw as a scurrilous attack on Southerners and Southern honor. The day before, John Jay II is saying, "This speech is fantastic, beautiful, wonderful. We're going to get this printed." And then when Sumner is essentially martyred, he doesn't die, but he's incapacitated through this brutal act of violence on the floor of the Senate in the United States Capitol. John Jay II says, "I think this is what's going to turn some of these Wall Street lawyers that I've been working, like basically his tribe, his people, except that he's separated himself on this issue of slavery. But he's like, I think this is kind of what's going to bring the conservatives with me, because they can't abide by this sort of violence on the United States Capitol. It's an assault by the slave power. And so I'm not saying that he's cynical. I'm not saying he's like, oh, great, my friend, got beaten, but he understands that Sumner's martyrdom is politically useful. John's relationship with Sumner would ultimately sour during the Civil War because John Jay II really, really wanted to be an ambassador like his grandfather in his country's hour of need, just like John Jay, the original John Jay, had been America's man overseas in its hour of need. And Sumner never delivered, and it was very painful to John Jay II. And a lot of it has to do with no matter how high-minded their politics was, Sumner's patronage went to his fellow Massachusetts people, not to Jay of New York. And so that was very frustrating. And so too was, of course, the just shocking violence that broke out in New York City during the war. Because I just want to make sure I'm in the right place here, because John Jay II's neighbors in Westchester County were completely unmoved by his anti-slavery and mocked it. They never voted his way. But New York, and this horrible, shocking incident of the New York draft riots in July 1864, moved John Jay II and the Union League Club to step in where political leaders would not, because even in the wake of the draft riots, the Democratic governor of New York had little or no interest in raising Black troops. But John Jay II and his elite colleagues, because note what's happened here, the Civil War brought John Jay II, whose abolitionism was dividing him from profiting fully from his name and his pedigree. But with the Civil War, the name Jay as a nationalist name and an anti-slavery name fuses. And he is part of this organization, the Union League Club of New York. And they kind of fill in where the governor of New York won't, in helping to raise Black regiments, to raise the money for it, to stage parades, to honor them. And this is a picture of the second Black regiment raised in New York in March 1864. And John Jay II gave a speech, at the presenting of the colors to this regiment. In some ways, the Civil War vindicates the efforts that they wanted. So what I want to talk about in closing is to jump ahead a little bit in the Jay family story, and actually sort of bring New York and New England into line. So despite the divisions in the abolitionist movement that I talked about in the 1840s and 50s, you can literally see in the Jay family tree, I think I can actually point to it right here. There is a kind of literal melding of the radical New Englanders and the more political New Yorkers when Maria Weston Chapman, who was one of Garrison's right-hand collaborators and supporters in New England, her son marries John Jay II's daughter in 1859. And that's like a literal embodiment of this sort of, there are bigger issues than issues of style because of the Underground Railroad, because of the militants of the South, because of the emergence of the Republican Party. Some of these splits between the New England radicals and the New Yorkers are healed. And you see this literally embodied in the marriage of Eleanor Jay and Henry Chapman. And they have a son by the name of John Jay Chapman, who goes on to become a really well-noted, well-read public intellectual in the late, and a performer and a man of letters in the late 19th and early 20th century. And I'm going to actually end with him, because in 1912, John Jay Chapman drew on his abolitionist heritage to make a profound statement on race in America in response to a horror both common and cruel into the 20th century, that of lynching. And I should say, this is a total aside, but it was just in Montgomery, Alabama, to see the National Lynching Memorial. And if you can go there, go there. It's just breathtaking, and it's a place of reflection, really powerful. And the lynching that I'm about to talk about is one of the lynchings that's memorialized there. I mean, there's this installation where they have gathered dirt from lynching sites around America, and put them in jars and labeled them and installed them on a wall. It was one of those powerful experiences I had in working on this project just a couple of weeks ago, was staring at the earth taken from Coatesville, Pennsylvania, where Zachariah Walker, a Virginia black man who was working in Coatesville, Pennsylvania, was dragged by a mob from his hospital bed to die on a bonfire fueled by wooden fencing, straw, and hay, as literally thousands of people, Pennsylvanians, lived on. Prosecutors utterly failed to hold anyone accountable for this gruesome extralegal execution. Reading about this event, Chapman, who lived in New York's Hudson Valley, felt the sting of guilt and injustice. To mark the anniversary of Walker's lynching, he traveled to Coatesville, which is here in a little west of Philadelphia, where he gave a speech to an empty room, a virtually empty room, on the anniversary of this lynching. The community wanted to move on, but John J. Chapman couldn't. He proclaimed, "The subject we are dealing with is not local. Some months ago, I asked a friend who lives not far from here something about this case, and he replied to me, it wasn't in my county. And that made me wonder whose county it was in, and it seemed to be in my county." In his speech, which was widely published, Chapman insisted that neither time nor place absolved his readers or himself of this horrible crime. This great wickedness that happened in Coatesville is not the wickedness of Coatesville nor of today. It is the wickedness of all America and of 300 years. All of us are tinctured by it. John J. Chapman distilled his New York and New England forebears' determination to assert universal principles in the face of terrifying truths that still resonate today. For better and worse, whatever county we find ourselves in, the history of our country endures. Thank you for listening, and please, I'm happy to answer any and all questions that you have. So I am truly happy to take questions. Yes, really.
So as the Jays moved forward through the 19th century, the generation became more radicalized, William and John II. When they started talking about some of these radical programs like the Freedmen's Bureau, giving back, giving to the enslaved, the newly freed 40 acres, was there consideration by the next generation, by William and John II, of reparations, of restitution, of paying back, compensating for the stolen labor and dignity of these people? Did they recognize that obligation?
Not as such. I think the way they saw their obligation was to fight this fight. John J. II was very keen, very early in the war, that this war needed, that African Americans needed to be a part of this war effort. Long before Lincoln arrived at that conclusion, John J. II had reached that conclusion. What they were involved in the Freedmen's, or William died in 1858, but John J. II was involved in the Freedmen's Aid Society, and he spoke on the same bill as Frederick Douglass in New York there. Like a lot of Republicans, had high hopes dashed that they thought Andrew Johnson might be okay until they realized that he was going 180 degrees in the other direction. And so John J. II is in line with the radical Republicans. But one of the things that happens to John J. II is he gets his wish, which is to be an ambassador. And so he is essentially, in the 1870s, he is out of the picture. So he gets appointed to be the US consul to the Habsburg Empire. So he's off in Vienna, basically from 1872 to 1877. So he leaves a country that is reaching the high tide of radical Reconstruction, which, as you know, is not, it was most definitely radical, but other than a few people like Thaddeus Stevens, the voices were few and far between for true reparations. And Thaddeus Stevens had it worked out in his head. He's like, take the property of the top 10% wealthiest Southerners, and both as punishment and as restitution, distributed amongst African Americans. But Thaddeus Stevens, the radical's radical, was to the left of even where the radical Republicans were. And as I say, John Jay II is out of the picture. And when he comes back to the United States for good, it's a very different country. And the sort of other side of him, the ambitious side of him, kind of triumphs over the willingness, and he's not alone in this, in willing to fight the long fight. So yes, every presidential election, John Jay II will literally, almost literally, not literally, wave the bloody shirt of you cannot let Democrats win. They will reverse the progress of, even though it's already, in free fall, they will enact all sorts of policies. These are the people we fought in the Civil War. So he waves the bloody shirt. He's a big proponent of a bill called the Blair Bill, which was one of the earliest attempts to get the federal government seriously involved in funding public education, because the idea was the South is woefully behind, even though Reconstruction Constitutions for the first time in the South created public schooling in the South, woefully behind in public education. And the sort of notion was, if we can pump federal dollars into the South, that will be sort of a rising tide. It might not be desegregation of the schools, but it will level the educational playing field. But really, John Jay II mostly moves on, gets very, very involved in civil service reform, and writes about it with the same moral indignation as if he were writing about this earlier cause, which was really the greatest cause he was involved in. Also, a very ugly side to John Jay II's anti-Catholic and anti-immigration writings. He's the person who basically hires Josiah Strong, who wrote the Scree, Our Country, about the dangers of immigration destroying everything that's good and holy and wonderful about America. This tide of Catholic immigrants was going to carry away our country. And John Jay II is right there with him in that kind of prejudice. So he's not a man without prejudices. And also, he kind of likes being the guy that you call on to give a speech on in 1876 on the centennial, or to commemorate the Battle of Harlem Plains. So he kind of leans more into his John Jay-ness than his William Jay-ness in his final years. And John Jay Chapman, right? I mean, this is kind of a wonderful moment. I wish I could tell you John Jay Chapman became a big advocate for African-American causes. It's sort of a moment. It's effervescent. It's one of the most profound short statements on race in America that I've read from the early 20th century, certainly by a white writer. But he doesn't lean into that wheel. But as you know, and I learned after the writing of the book, there are all kinds of interesting stories. That there's a Chiefland relative who was a direct descendant who was raising money he's the chief fundraiser for the Scottsboro Boys in the 1930s in New York City, which I did not know about till after I wrote the book. And in some ways, I'm glad I did not know as much now, having met some descendants, about what happens next, or I might not be here because I'd be in some archive writing the third and fourth epilogue. But the story does continue in really interesting ways that are well worth pursuing. But I can't say that they lean into a notion of reparation and restitution. And I mean, I think there's a sort of powerful and sadly, as it turns out, misguided optimism about what this moment can sustain. And then, like I say, then he sort of takes his eye off the ball. But he does say one of the last letters of his life to a former abolitionist colleague, he understood that abolition ultimately was the most meaningful cause that he ever embraced, but it doesn't retain traction in the last 17-year arc of his life, from the end of Reconstruction to his death in 1894. That's a great question. Yes.
Are there living Jay descendants you've connected with?
And there's one in this room, and maybe more than one. Yeah, that's been a real pleasure. People have reached out to me, and we've had some great Zoom calls. And the questions I've got, some of the most pointed, what can you tell us questions I've gotten from readers are from Jay descendants, and their questions are rightfully so, to want to know a lot more about the enslaved and formerly enslaved people. And I certainly am happy to, there's many stories I can share, but there's a lot that we don't know. And what I would like to believe is the answers we don't know yet. these are really important questions, and some of the Jay descendants are the ones asking those questions. And that's, I think, really kind of wonderful and inspiring.
Did any of them have papers still in their own possession?
So, the history of Jay paper, I don't know. If they do, email me, let's know. But it's interesting. One of the reasons why John Jay undoubtedly is in that sort of top 7 of the founding fathers, most importantly, unquestionably. But unlike the others, there is no massive 35-volume National Endowment of the Humanities funded project of the Jay papers. There is a very excellent 7-volume recently completed selected papers. And a lot of it is because a lot of the papers stayed in the Jay family a lot longer. The Adams turned everything over to the Massachusetts Historical Society. George Washington's papers, George Washington obviously didn't have any direct descendants. Jefferson's papers, I can't remember exactly how they get into federal hands, but most of the major founders, their papers got into hands at a time when, in the mid-20th century, when there was a lot of money being invested in producing these series. Because the Jay family is large and generation after generation of people, the house stays in the family until the 1950s, when it's given over to the state of New York as a state historic site. And so the papers don't start making their way to Columbia University, which has, where not, I don't know if it's most of them there, but that's the easiest place to access them, really start dribbling in the 30s, 40s, 50s and onwards. And then at the John Jay Homestead, which I urge all of you to visit, like if you have an image in your head of what a founder's house looks like, and it's Mount Vernon and Monticello, those are great places, but 5 minutes at the Jay Homestead in New York, and like there's very different founders' worlds. And they have a lot of materials, and none of that is scanned, and most of it's not really cataloged as such. There are boxes that have labels like John Jay II, letters, but they have not been given the full university treatment. And I was able to, that is a place among many institutions that have been incredibly generous to me in letting me go through the papers. But I am absolutely certain there is more to be learned about the Jays, probably including the Jays in slavery as scholars. And one of my fondest hopes is that scholars will want to, the best thing that can happen is that they find out, here's what you got wrong, here's a gap we need to fill, here's a different way to tell the story. And a lot of that stuff is easily accessible at Columbia or accessed with much more difficulty in the Homestead. But maybe there'll be an initiative to get more of the Jay papers into places where scholars can work with them virtually and in person. But yeah, but there are, you could spend a lifetime reading Jay papers because they were very prolific in their personal correspondence. Yes.
John, when he became active as a college student,
Yes.
was that uncommon, or
Very.
I mean, was there any divide in terms of younger people then and whatever? But
It's a great question. So I mean, that it was very unusual for a Columbia student. Columbia was not a hotbed of anti-slavery. This was not, the young men that he was partnering with were not, and his professors, including his own uncle, William Jay's brother-in-law, who was a revered professor there. And there's a great Columbia and slavery website that Eric Foner and his students made. Columbia is not a hotbed of anti-slavery radicalism by any means. There are other colleges like Oberlin, even my alma mater, Amherst, where you can see like activity on campus, but it's the city. He's in the city, and that's where he finds community. But no, the curriculum and the tradition of education at Columbia would not have been what had pushed him in that direction. And he was always pushed. I mean, his mother, Augusta, married to William Jay. I mean, I've read a letter where she's basically like, you have been given a great name. And she's also the only son, for those of you who are looking at the family tree. And he was basically like, you have to make something of this name. And one of the principal ways he made something of that name was his increasing commitment to the anti-slavery cause. But like I said, it's definitely not something he learned. There were no radical professors, stoking the flames of these innocents. It was, this was something he brought to it. We definitely did not learn that in school. Yes.
It's striking that you mentioned the cooperative efforts between the slaves and the enslaved people in the South and the poor whites in the South. We know about Bacon's Rebellion and some of these other things. There's a great fear of that. So it sounds like that kind of relationship never developed in the North. Is that an accurate perception?
Yeah, I mean, there are. I mean, I don't want to say that there are no. There is a strain of sort of working class radicalism on slavery issues, but by and large, the working class party in the North is the Democratic Party, which is a white supremacist party. There are exceptions to that, and we can find politicians, but the vast majority of working class men that were politicized in the North were Democrats, and the Democratic Party and its alliance with the South is tight, very tight, and not just before the war, but even during the war, the sort of Copperheadism and the riots, obviously in New York City, proved that. There is a strain when you think about Bacon's Rebellion, going back to my colonial history roots. I mean, there's no question that upcountry whites, not out of racial brotherhood and sympathy, but upcountry whites, mountainous regions of North Carolina, Alabama, Tennessee, there's a real unionist streak that develops in those places. There is, and it definitely undermined the Southern war effort, and was one of the reasons why the South and Southern leaders were very concerned about once they lost their almost absolute grip on power in Washington. They were also worried about, because most white families did not own slaves, but the slaveocracy dominated the politics.
Right.
And so the freak out of Lincoln's election without basically a single Southern vote, electoral or even actual individual, they're very worried about where the trend lines are going, both at the national level and to some extent with their own society, because if slavery isn't allowed to grow across the expanding United States, what kinds of conflicts is that going to cause? And it is, among many other things, one of the most colossal miscalculations in history that they launched a secessionist movement to protect the institution, and nothing hastened the end of slavery more than secession. But yeah, there's not a strong. I mean, there's a real strong streak of fear of African Americans coming north. I mean, so you have places like Ohio and Indiana that try to make it very difficult or even illegal for free African Americans to move into the state. I mean, those laws are honored in the breach, but they still make a statement. And a real rivalry, a sort of notion, much like in Virginia after Bacon's Rebellion, that whiteness is a kind of property that is, even if you have very little of actual property, it's a kind of property and inheritance that has to be guarded, which means marginalizing, intimidating, driving out of the public spaces of African Americans. And certainly that's a very common problem. And
It's the background of the cast.
yeah, and it does produce chaos in the streets. Not just, I cited 2 riots in New York, but of course Cincinnati had riots. There's the murder of Elijah Lovejoy. There's all kinds of popular mobbing activities that demonstrate the sort of ways in which the respectable opinion and that sort of partnering of quote unquote respectable opinion of men of status and standing in property and working class whites allying to sort of marginalize African Americans and those whites like the Jays who are willing to take up the cause. So it is, it may seem morally obvious to us, but it was distinctly a iconoclastic choice that the Jays made to throw in these radical propositions until it ultimately, with the rise of the Republican Party, was sort of re-mainstream. And as I said, John Jay II thinks, now being a Jay and a nationalist and an abolitionist, these things are finally brought into alignment again.
Yeah.
And he sees that as the main chance. So it's an excellent question. I don't know where we are in time. You probably want to wrap it up, but I'm more than happy to talk informally and to sign books. So,
Thank you so much.
oh, thank you.